Hey, we are back, and welcome to another Forensic Happy Hour. Again, bringing on another expert in the field, and I think with Mario Samalas that we're gonna, I think have a pretty good take on it, and try and you know what I think as I was telling before the show is that to kind of maybe dive into it a little bit more. Not, obviously, we don't want to keep you guys, too long, but just kind of some basics on, that can maybe help out that you might have of the people who are currently in the industry, or maybe people that want to get into the industry. I think it's going to be, well, I know it's going to be a great show, and I'm really looking forward to it. So fantastic. It's good to see you, Mario. Thank you again for being on the show. And I, you know, I, I know it's going to be good, and I'm looking forward to kind of getting your take. I know that yeah, with James when he was on the show and everything, said that you're the man, and that's we had to make sure that we had and brought you on. So what I want you to do is, let's get into a little bit, and I said you can start when you're 3 years old if you'd like, but give a little story of where your the path kind of started and what you're doing now.
Absolutely. Hey everyone, Marcus Moles, thanks for having me on the show. Looking forward to this great conversation. But I would say, I've just been a love of science since I was a little kid. I was that kid who always just loved not only doing something right, but why does it work the way it does? And just kind of that analytical mindset. One of my fondest memories, and I joke about this, and it's kind of a common thing when you talk about professionals in the industry, taking apart like family electronics, just to understand why does it work the way it did. And obviously, I got in serious trouble because I couldn't put it back together. Family and parents came home and they're like, well, okay, well, why is this alarm
Where's this
clock in
screw? There's a
millions of
screw
pieces
that's
here?
sitting, and
Yeah.
there's screw. Where does that go?
Well, and more importantly, not only just taking it apart, but what can I do with it from there? Right. It was, and as I tell people, I kind of grew up. I'm a child of the 80s and 90s. Right. I was born in 85, but really, I'm the AOL generation, as we all joke around. Right. We grew up with the old school modems and having to wait forever to get on the internet and figuring things out. But I was a young teenager at the time, maybe I don't know, 12 years old, 11, 12 years old. Somehow, me and my brother convinced our parents, and we were dirt poor, to get a computer. I don't even know to this day how we even got one, this old rickety computer. And just went from there, just spending hours and hours instead of doing schoolwork online, just trying to figure out where can I go? What can I do with it? Okay, why does this work the way it does? And, as kids there wasn't really a pipeline for cybersecurity back then, or kind of IT security, anything in general. It was just kind of people figuring things out as your own. And, making friends along the way, and some of them you didn't really know who they were, and hoping for the best. And I quickly realized, like, hey, I loved playing with malware. But one of the fascinations that I had, even as a 13-year-old kid, was malicious code. And most people, when I say that to them, when they ask me about that, it's like, what, were you just trying to be a criminal? Like, what was going on with that? No, for me, it's kind of like, like a doctor looks at some kind of new ailment, and they're more of like the curiosity, like, wow, even though this thing is really, really bad, I want to understand, why does it work the way it does? How does it actually work? So it's that curiosity, that scientific curiosity. And that's kind of where it came from. And I quickly realized, like, hey, the path I'm going is not really necessarily condoned in this day and age, in this world. And I didn't want to get snatched up by a three-letter agency somewhere, or go to jail, basically, because there was no pipeline. Go to school, go do cybersecurity. You could do a traditional comp sci program, but I wasn't really interested in learning calculus. Sorry, just I didn't want to become an engineer somewhere, even though I probably could have. It wasn't interesting to me, so I kind of joined the military from there, because I always wanted to be in the military. So I left New York City, joined the military when I was 18. Shortly after 9/11 occurred, I was in downtown New York City when that all happened, when I was in high school. So I was still very vivid in my mind. Joined the military, and went from there. Just spent basically 18, 17 years touring the world, 15 of those active duty, and now I'm in the National Guard. But I went from active duty infantry, jumping out of airplanes, propelling out helicopters, kicking doors in, the typical thing you think of the infantry. But I was always doing IT stuff along the way as well. And most people, when they think of the infantry, they think of, oh, just a bunch of grunts running around with a bunch of gear looking to break things, right? We're just looking to kick doors in and just come in that stereotypical, like almost Call of Duty mindset. But it was a lot more that we were doing. So my leadership, realized, hey, we have somebody in this unit who's really math science intensive. In fact, the standardized tests you do in the military, even though it's kind of funny to me, it's felt really easy when I
Yeah.
did it in high
Can you
school.
fly a helicopter? And it's funny because it's like a sorting test, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like the military's version of putting the sorting hat on in Harry Potter
Exactly.
and figure out where you're going to
Exactly.
go. And based on that score dictates, your future essentially, right? Um, so I scored really well, really high. I think my recruiter had told me I was in the 5th percentile in the math and science section. And my leadership kind of, as I started getting in the military, realized like, hey, we got this guy who has a real lot of math and science. I started going to schools for math and science, not your typical, how many push-ups can you do and we'll send you to the school. It was all about performance. So that's how I learned how to do like demolitions in the military. And they started sending me like these almost pseudo computer forensics courses. And what I mean by that is you roll up to an incident, confiscate a bunch of cell phones. How do we take like Cellbrite tools and rip data out of them and package things up and start doing some of that kind of low level data collection? But that's still, very good entry point into it because that data has to come from somewhere, right? You got to have those boots on the ground to collect the data for other people to analyze. And, it just started going from there.
Yeah.
From years later, find myself as an instructor in the army, and while I was doing that, I was going to school, for cybersecurity, and kind of realized, with the help of my wife, kind of realized I need to go back to school. And really, the military is great and all, but I want to be home for my family. I'm always gone all the time. I want to watch my kids grow up. So I went back to school, landed my first job as an intern for the state of Colorado doing cybersecurity, and kind of took it from there.
Hmm.
That's kind of my origin story in a nutshell, if you will.
Yeah, and so taking that, obviously, again, for people who watch the show, they always hear me say, the majority of people that I talk to didn't necessarily, well, all of them did not say, you know what? So I went to, I high school, I graduated high school, went to college, and I knew from day one when I graduated high school that I was going to wind up doing forensics or I'm going to do cybersecurity. To be in that, absolutely zero. It's there's a lot of psychology people. There's a
Yeah,
lot of different types of things. So what is it that all of a sudden you said, shit? You know what? I got to do this. This is part of my life because I want to continue to do that. So I mean, what was that kind of that spark that you had? Because obviously, and I'm not speaking for you, but I mean, it wasn't necessarily where you were going to go, right? So what is it? I mean, can you remember a day or something that just you said, okay, I got to do this?
absolutely, absolutely. And it's kind of multiple. I would say it's multiple events that kind of led down that path, right? It's almost like you want to make a big decision in your life, and then you realize at some point later on, reflecting on it, that there was multiple intermediary steps that kind of led down that path. It wasn't one singular event. That's how it was in my case. So I always, like I said, even when I'm in the middle of Afghanistan or Iraq, I always had my laptop with me. I'd bought at the time. I was always tinkering around with things, and that was just kind of a hobby. But as I progressed further and further in the military, later on, especially, I would say around 2011 or so, 2012, when me and my wife got married, I remember I was talking to her about thinking about going back to college because, I left college. I was bored with school. It wasn't challenging, all throughout my life up until college. And I was just like, hey, I want to go back to school because obviously the military is great and all, but I want to do something afterwards. I don't want to just, be in the military my entire life. That's great. What happens after when I retire, or however long I stay? And we kind of tossed around some ideas. We're talking about science. I'm great in science. I love science. Talking about doing maybe becoming a physical therapist because I loved physiology, things of that nature, right? And I've really narrowed it down to two decisions. Okay, both are science. Either I want to do something IT based, right? And I didn't know that there was a pipeline at the time for cybersecurity. I was like IT, some computer science, something like that, or something like traditional sciences, right? Become a physiologist, for example, things of that nature. And my wife's like, look, you're up till who knows what hour of the night, every night on your computer, goofing off, not even playing games. She's like, I'd be happy if you were just playing games. At least I understand what you're doing there. You're out there taking things apart, reading up on documentation, trying to figure things out, and self-teach yourself all this what looks like almost archaic or arcane knowledge. She's like, I really think you should go for something IT based. So I started doing some research and realized that there's more to the world than just, okay, your help desk guy or your network admin and so forth. And that's where I started just, as I did more research, kind of pursued. And then I started falling into, as I read more, traditional reading about forensics and malware analysis and things like that. And all it did was just revive that love that I had as a child, ripping apart malicious code. Looking at that and like, aha, this is really, it just felt like a little kid in a candy store anymore. And it wasn't this is a hobby, now it became an obsession. And then from there, it didn't feel like an obsession, in an unhealthy way. It was a constructive projects that I was doing, but it didn't feel like a chore at all. It was just playing, like when you play sports because you love playing sports, not because somebody told you must go learn this. And that still carries on to this day as well.
Yeah, so if you talk about that, especially on the malware side, because I know that this is kind of the if you will, like a forte, but
A
this
niche
is
area.
kind of, yeah, this is where you want, right? And so what is it? Because with the computer science, you don't have. I mean, it's different types. What is it that I mean? How can you take and be able to analyze static, dynamic, however that you're going to go and look at this type and to decide how how it's going to interact? I mean, what kind of stuff do you need to know?
Okay. Well, that's a very great question. That's actually a very common one that I get. So I always tell people, regardless of what you're going to do in cybersecurity, you need to have a solid foundation, regardless of what you do. So if you don't understand things like network protocols, right, basic security concepts, system architecture, you're not going to go far. Sure, you can regurgitate someone else's work or run some tools, but you never understand the why behind it. When that tool fails, you want to understand why, and you won't be able to actually interact with the system or do something, because everything has to follow. Whether you're a pen tester, you're doing you're a true adversary, or even a blue team member, everything has to follow networking protocols, right? The rules of the network. So you have to have that solid foundation to begin with. From there, I look at it as, okay, you have to have some kind of programming background, some experience. You don't have to be a developer, but you have to understand some basics in some of the languages. And the more you can code or script, the better off you will be. For instance, I'll give you an example. I very rudimentary in C, C++, but understanding, because one of the first languages I learned was ironically Java. When I went to school, that's the language they made us. When I was in college, we had to learn Java. Looking back at it, that was great, because even though I am not a expert in C, C++, because of my exposure to Java, I am now able to understand more of that language because they come from a same construct. Syntactically, grammatically, they're similar. Same thing with like Golang, for example. So that it gives you that commonality to work from. Things that are non-strong type languages like Python, for example, other languages that fit in that same category, you can figure them out because of that exposure. And obviously, the more exposure you have, the better off you'll be from there.
Right. I think
You
that's
know.
again. I think it's pretty important. One is two, that you don't necessarily have to go in and have a CS degree to go into cybersecurity. Right. I mean, that's it. It comes down to you still have to understand, right? I think that you hit the nail on the head, especially network protocols, right? Because malware doesn't necessarily say, "Hey, I just want to make your screen look bad." It wants to get outside, right? It wants to propagate. It wants
Absolutely.
to do that. So understanding how those conduits arrive and different types of ports and everything else it is extremely important, I think, right? So how I guess what are some recommendations that you might have too of having that foundation, which I 100% agree with you, is on the network, the communication side of it outside, say the intranet or even the intranet. You can actually go obviously different. But what do people need to? What's that basic thing that people need to do?
Okay, so absolutely. First, the first recommendation I always give people is non-technical. It's more psychological. I always ask people, what is the differentiation between a valid program versus a malicious one? If usually if you people will come up with it eventually, it's always intent. A lot of times they're still following the same protocol, same understanding. How a valid program may interact with the Windows API call, for example, is still the same as how a malicious one. How a program will open up a web page and try to interact with it at that low level. Malware is going to do the same thing. You understand the intent behind it and why it's trying to do it. So there's that psychological aspect of it, right? And understanding, okay, these systems, we're not standing in mainframe type generation where everything's air gapped, everything's isolated, everything's interconnected. So it's going to look to do something beyond potentially your system itself or your network. How does it go? Well, start templating in my head. If I was a adversary or I was a malicious payload, what would I be trying to do? How are some of the common ways that I might be trying to get out of your network? Maybe I'm trying to propagate via SMB and find other victims that I'm trying to infect. I steal the data. Okay, well, what do I want to do with it from there? What's the next step? I need to talk home at some point. Well, how am I going to do that? There's certain protocols you can use like DNS, HTTP, HTTPS, et cetera, to beacon out and give further instructions, right? So understanding how it's not just having that foundation, but then you add in that layer of psychology of attacker mindset. If I was an adversary, this kind of adds more weight into how you're going to be looking for these things, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
And, yeah, and so I'm a mobile guy, right? And
Hmm.
so I think again, and this is my thing, and 100% correct me if I'm wrong. But so on the mobile side of it, is the intent, that you were talking about, the intent on say a mobile, some sort of malicious, say APK or some malicious package that you have on a device, is the intent different there versus you might have a on that's going to infect, say, a network. And let me just give you the example that, and this is why I'm
Hmm.
thinking this, is that from what I see, the intent that you might have is for a mobile device is for me kind of in a small way is almost a monetary side of it, right? Is that I'm going to try to make some money on it. I'm going to try to do this type of stuff of it just because it's a mobile device. However, I'm going to do this. But if I go and I look at, say, a system, I mean, look at a lot of the hacks that might be on the network itself. It's not necessarily monetary. Obviously ransomware and all those others kind of
Yeah.
sideways. But what I'm talking about is actually infrastructure. I'm talking about bad things we're talking state actor stuff. So is the intent different, or is it pretty much still monetary, the majority, if we're going to talk percentages, right?
I would say the intent in a lot of times is very similar, right? It obviously everything's going to depend on the target and what I'm trying to achieve from that target, right? The intent. A government organization, I may not be caring about monetary. Maybe I'm looking for the R&D data, for example, right? You break in a defense contractor, I'm looking for some research project instead of some mom and pop shop, where I might just care about ransoming their systems to gain money off of them. So obviously, it's all about the target and what the actual intent behind that target is. I would argue that a lot of what you're seeing on the mobile side is very similar to traditional network. And I say that because think about it. We have our phones. I mean, my phone's tethered with me everywhere I go. Most of our phones, we have them synced up to our Google profiles, our Facebook, whatever we're connected to. So this just becomes an extension of your laptop, your desktop, wherever you're at. The data's still the same. So a lot of times it might be harder for me to get into your corporate system or your personal system. It might be easier on your cell phone because maybe your restrictions are less because you want to play games on your phone, or because company policy you haven't applied on your phone, or because you downloaded something for convenience that you might have not done on your personal system or your work system.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just another means to achieve the same goal, same intent, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I kind of I didn't want to set you up for that, but I kind of did because I love Google because as an examiner and an
Hmm.
investigator, I love when other people use it.
Absolutely.
Anything and everything that's tied to that, especially again,
The
the
cookies.
mobile device itself, everything it does not. It's just they want to know so much and they want to eat so much of your profiles and everything else. Is that it's great as an investigator. Yeah, you could almost look at just the information that's laid out within Google, or your Facebook, Instagram, or anything owned by Facebook, or anything
Absolutely.
else of that to completely obliterate some of the, and that's a bad word, but to be able to really paint a picture of actions of a lot of the things that back in the day, when I'm doing mobile device examinations, it's like, what, here's this flip. I'm kid you not, flip
Flip phone,
phone.
yeah.
It only can hold like 25 messages that you might have on a SIM card, and you have that. Now we're talking hundreds of thousands. Obviously of communications, and that's a small part of actually communication that goes out, right? That's going out, and the communication that comes back to those types of devices. So let me segue into that. Is how much of a threat are mobile devices within the infrastructure of a corporate network or
I
even a
would
government network?
Oh, well, I would say they're just as threat as anything else, right? They're another tool that you use in your life. It's a matter of how do you properly secure it? How do you properly, if you want, let's say, you want to allow your employees to use their phones at work, maybe they segment them off to a guest network, or maybe they have to abide by certain rules. Maybe you don't allow them and you give them a work phone and you tell them, here you go, this is your work phone. It is only for work purposes, and separate it. When I was a consultant in a former life, my employee gave me a work phone and that's it. I always had two phones, on my personal and my work phone, and I segmented everything off of it. Even if it was a Google search to look for something for that my wife wanted to buy, let's say she wanted new patio furniture, I was doing it on my personal phone, not my work phone, for that particular reason, right? And it kind of kept everything separated. The second point a lot of people fail to miss is that, and Google, obviously we could talk years about what motivation they might have or why we think they're doing what they're doing, right? We'll leave that at that. But Windows, the Windows operating system, right? Your phones, a lot of the data that they're gobbling up, it is not because they're trying to spy on you, but they're actually just trying to be helpful, inadvertently helpful, as I call it.
Right.
To us as investigators, that is a gold mine for us.
Yeah.
Every time I set a preference on my phone, there's all this metadata that gets set back there to remember it and keep it. Well, when I sift through it as an analyst, whether I'm doing forensics on a Windows system or you doing on a mobile phone, that is a wealth of information, breadcrumbs that you piece together to paint the whole picture and put into context why they were doing, not only why, but maybe why their intent was, or was it them? Was it a malicious actor acting in their name, et cetera, et cetera. So that's
Yeah.
a lot of that data is there that people miss and they forget, well, Google's spying on me. Well, maybe not directly. Maybe they're doing it because they think by me getting this data, it'll help me personalize things for you that makes your experience better. I don't know.
No, no, no. You're exactly right. I mean, you're exactly right. Is that it comes down to we're lazy, right?
Yeah.
And so it's the same thing. If you look at back in the old days, majority of all the iOS devices are going to be backed up via the cloud now. No longer
Yep.
to tethered, right? That you're not going to tether it to your computer. But right, there's a pairing record that you would use if I plug it in and I'm going to go and hey, I need to back up my phone, or I want to plug it into iTunes or whatever. It communicates, handshakes, everything else, creates a
Yep.
pairing record. You know why? So I don't have to enter that code in because I'm too lazy to do it.
Absolutely.
And so it's kind of it's the same thing. And you're exactly right. It comes down to that convenience factor. But I mean, we can completely do a whole show on security that versus convenience, because the problem that these companies have, the Apples, the Microsofts, the Googles, have that fine line, right? Of we need to protect everyone's stuff, but we can't make it so freaking hard for them to operate this device or to do what they need to do, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, obviously Apple moved it on. They're forcing, it used to have to be this pin. Now it's obviously a different pin that you have, secure startup now with Android, all these different types of things that they're trying to make things more secure, but it just pisses people off because they're like, dude, I have to stand on my foot. I have to do this to even get into an application, right? Now I got to put my fingerprint. It doesn't work. Okay, now I got to put a pin in, right? And so again, I think it's that fine line. But the best part about that comes down to the ability to I don't want to use the word, but I will exploit that
Absolutely.
because that's exactly what it is. I don't think they can ever, and there are there's a lot of devices, a black phone that came out a while ago. People are like, dude, I don't want to use this thing because it's too hard to do it. There's too much security. I don't want to do this. I'm not even going to. Right. And so I think that it just comes down to us relying on that human factor. right?
Absolutely.
Of trying to exploit that. And I don't think it's going to go away. I really don't think it's
No.
because people are they're the persons that buy the product. So, I mean, do you think otherwise?
No, I completely agree with you. It will not go away. And kind of going back to our previous comments about intent, these same methods that you use as an analyst, a lot of times that we as analysts in the community use to get after the information we need for a case, the attackers are leveraging those same techniques or similar techniques to get into a network or into a system.
Right.
But it just goes on intent. And the problem is that a lot of people they don't genuinely start being concerned about these things, about security, about privacy, unless it directly impacts them.
Mm-hmm.
So if they do not see an actual effect, they're just happy living in their bubble.
Right.
Not to pick on my wife, but recently just to kind of demonstrate to her, some of the issues because she's, I talked to her. I was like, hey, did you see about this on the news? And she's like, no. She's like, I don't really care. I glanced over it. I really didn't care about it. I was like, okay. As a demonstration, I'm like, how fast do you think I can get into your system? Your laptop, I don't know your password. I was able to guess it based on her patterns, based on observables that she's done, even though I do not know her password offhand. I was able to quickly, I think it was the third try I was in. And she's like, well, why? I was like, just to prove a point that if I can do it, do you not think someone else for malicious intent can't do it?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
she kind of realized like, okay, what do I need to do to fix this? And I started going through the whole thing, and her eyes just glossed over. Why do I need to do all these steps? Why do I need to lock this down? Why do I need to change all my passwords, have password vaults, have password phrases instead of guessable passwords? And she's the exact same response. This is inconvenient for me. I just
Yeah.
want to get online, get on Facebook, get wherever I need to, so that way I can do my day. For me, I'm ready to rip my hair out. I'm like, no, this is how you get exploited by the attackers.
But I mean, that's 90% of the entire world's population is exactly that, right? Is that, well, if you look at any breach or you look at all these other stuff, they dial things back. It always comes back to that person that's sitting there behind the
Absolutely.
keyboard or whatever that accepted something. And it's no fault. I mean, this stuff's getting pretty sophisticated that they go through. And I mean, there's whole, spending thousands of dollars a month on phishing exercises that people now that it were the people that developed these systems were actually the fishers that did it before, right? That developed these systems. Now they're like, hey, do it for good, which is great, right? With the education side of it, but I mean, how about the last year and a half?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that. About I don't want to say target-rich environment, but you have these people that are working remote and from their home systems, and the time to surf on the Gap or Facebook or anything else and doing this stuff, but while doing their work because they don't want to go and get another laptop, they're going to use this stuff. I mean, does that bring a completely new, I don't want to say issue, but it is an issue, I
Yeah.
think. So how do you see the next year of having to deal with the last year and a half?
So interesting you bring that up. I would say that once again, I don't think much has changed. I think it's only gotten worse, and it's bringing the problem more to the forefront. It's not just us security guys or gals yelling in the background saying, "Hey, this is a problem. You need to fix this. You can't be on your home network that's not secure, looking at your Gmail, for example, while you're on your corporate laptop doing other stuff at work for HR accounting." It just becomes it's in everyone's face now, and now that's why it appears to be a greater issue than what it is. I just think, and the attacks are only going to increase, right? If everyone's at home, well, guess what? These are weaker systems than at work. I think from when COVID onset, I was remember looking at some kind of generalities, general numbers. There's been an exponential increase in attacks, right? Last year there was billions of dollars worth of ransoms that occurred. I mean, look at Garmin, for example, the damage that they did when they broke into their network. And Garmin's with us almost every day. We have medical systems that use Garmin for navigation, military, et cetera. The list goes on. And that was, I think, numbers put it everywhere from like 50 to $60 million total cost.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. So this is only going to increase. It's here to stay. The problem is a lot of people don't understand, what do we do with it? How do we lock this down and make it a um, more resilient network, maybe more resilient for our corporate network, or we put in some safeguards in there. Things like, well, you're only allowed to, on your corporate network, we lock it down. You're only allowed to use certain applications that we've deemed necessary. If you're HR, you probably only need to, let's say, log in, go to something like a Bastion host, and then go from there, VPN out from there.
Mm-hmm.
There's many ways to kind of slice it. I just think that now it's gotten the attention it needed for so long.
Yeah, the problem that we have, though, again, just coming back to the human element, is that they're like, dude, I got to do what? No, I'm going to hook to my home Wi-Fi, or you know what? I'm going to go to the Starbucks and just cruise around there
Hmm.
because I can do, so again, it comes down to people,
Absolutely.
in trying to understand that side of it. So, before I ask you the next question, let's do proactive. What are the people, what can people do to, I guess, limit their exposure while they're working from home or while they're doing remote? I mean, what can a corporation tell people to do, or an IT person can tell those employees to do to help them?
Well, so I would say it starts from policy, and I'm not a big fan of policy, but there's a time and place for it, right? If acceptable use policy, have it granular, specifically spell it out and hold your employees accountable to it. If you tell them they cannot play, I don't know, let's say they can't play Xbox while they're at work, then so be it. Hold them to it. So it starts there, but also doing things like, okay, I'm not going to let you just directly connect to the network through unsecure credentials. You're in some unknown access point. It could be a Starbucks and it's connected to some rogue device that someone set up saying Starbucks Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi, right? Even though it's not the Starbucks Wi-Fi. Well, maybe you need to go and VPN in first, right? You need to, or go and hit the Bastion host, like I said, right? And then from there, you can move out into the network. So you have that intermediary layer. You're basically trying to, I would call it almost take the human element out of it, or kind of zero trust. I don't believe you're going to be secure, so I'm not going to assume you will be. You have to prove it to me. Things like HIPS checks. Your computer tries to get on the network. Does it meet certain patch levels? Does it have a certain operating system? What is actually on there? And if it meets those checks, then it can be on the network.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it cannot.
Yeah,
If you
100% piss
another
people off when you do
example,
that. They're like, I
absolutely,
can't get on.
but and that's where the leadership needs to look at it of an organization and say, okay, what is our acceptable tolerance? What level are we willing to go to it? And we need to stick to it. If we want to only certain individuals, let's say HR, because they're a greater target in finance for phishing expeditions, because they know, attackers know, they're the ones that can get all the resumes and all the bills and everything. And their job is to look at documents all day. So how easy would it be to send a PDF file that's a malicious document when it's masquerading as a resume?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, well, there's certain things I can do. I can't allow you to just go open up whatever application you want. Maybe, yes, you can get to those things that you need, but you need to authenticate first, and you can't have them resident on your system. You have to go into the secure environment first and work from there.
Mm-hmm.
So
So,
maybe you have to segment it based on role and responsibilities.
so talk to me about, really, I don't want to say soup to nuts because that might take a little while, but I mean,
Hmm.
I mean, what's your typical of I guess response, right? I mean, what is it that you say you identify, how do you go in and determine if it's malicious? I mean, what kind of tools, what are you doing? How can you help people that matter getting into it, or people that have been doing it for a long time? They're like, oh, that's a good idea.
Absolutely.
I mean, what are some things that you can go in and I guess, teach people
Okay.
from an event to resolution?
Absolutely. And I'll start first for the non-technical answer, I guess, that a lot of people don't like to hear is constantly read, read, keep up on new attacks that are going on, new exploits, new thing advances in system architecture. Windows released a new version of the operating system or patch, whether it be Linux, Mac, your phones. Read up on it, learn about the nitty-gritty details inside of it, so that way you know how to interact with it. Okay, so that's first. It's just like if I'm gonna be a doctor, I want to analyze, a virus. Well, if I don't understand how the human body works, I'm never going to be effective at analyzing that virus. It's always just be black box magic to me, right? So I would start there first. So, and that's a constant learning, just like a doctor. It's constantly learning and constantly keeping up with new advances. From there, applying the analytical mindset. So I almost apply a scientific reasoning to it, right? So I have a sample. Let's say I receive something, could be something from my Google spam folder that I'm just curious to see what I got, or an organization, or I got an alert, let's say on our EDR tool or SIM, and I'm looking at it and trying to determine what is this? Is this malicious or not? So first, I look at it kind of, what information do I have surrounding it? Was this a email that came in that looks suspicious? Maybe I need to go analyze the email headers, for example, and start looking at that, look at the conversation. I contact, Sally at HR. Were you expecting this email? Do you know this person? Is it valid? right? Just because I sent, let's say it says that it's under my name, were you expecting that email from me? And if so, was it the content that you were expecting? We were talking about, let's say, a payment for services rendered. Was that indeed what the invoice that you were expecting, or is it something else? So I approached that part, that human element first, because I can kind of control that. I can suss that out and make a quick determination before I have to start doing things like reverse engineering and in-depth analysis, because that's very time consuming.
Mm-hmm.
So start with those low-hanging fruits first, right? You work from there. So let's say that doesn't pass the eyeball test, or I have some doubts about it, right? Maybe Sally at HR told me, yes, I wasn't expecting this. I don't know if it's malicious or not, et cetera. So once I actually start getting that payload, I don't know, let's say it's an executable, as an example, or maybe a macro laden document. That's always your fun ones, right? But an executable, even simple things like start off first, low hanging fruit, hash that file. Get your MD5, SHA-1, SHA-256 hashes. Figure out the file type. Just because it says it's a .pdf file, it may not be a .pdf file. Don't trust it. Windows tells you it's a PDF. Well, what does the magic number, the actual content inside of it, tell you? The common trick I used to show people is what happens if you put a second extension on there? How's Windows going to read it? Is it an exe or is it a PDF now, right? And which one is it really? Well, if an operating system can't discern it, it uses the magic number, and regardless of what the extension is, right? Linux is smart about it, and so is OS X, that they don't care what the extension is. You can run files without extension and still work fine. So get that information first. So I figure out, okay, this is a, let's say, 64-bit executable, all right, based on the magic number. So you can run the file command, for example, or open up a hex editor and actually take a look at the first couple of bytes, right? Is it a valid executable? The 0 and 1 byte in the Windows executable will tell you if it is, right? You'll see the MZ or 4D5A in hex, or it might be flipped. So ZM 5A 4D, that's the hex sequence in the bytes. And that's just based off of the creator of MS-DOS.
So do you do this? Do you do this in a contained environment like a VM that you build?
Absolutely. So I have multiple analysis environments, right? And actually, not just a VM, I have physical systems as well. And the reason why I say that, so I have what I call my staked goats, right? The lab boxes that are, they're guinea pigs. If I have to burn these things down and rebuild them, so be it. They're old systems that I've had around the house that are just there for lab rats.
Right.
Why? Because some malicious code looks for anti-sandbox technology, right?
Right.
It does even things, simple things like not just looking for what type of antivirus software you're running, or if it's in a VM, but looking, querying the actual CPU and seeing what are the instructions set inside of it.
Right.
So I've seen that before, where we'll look at the 31st byte inside the actual CPU, and that'll tell you what type of system you're in, if it's a physical or virtualized environment, right? So I have these physical systems that I can now go and infect and see, does this malware behave differently in a physical versus a virtualized environment, or will it run at all, right?
Love
And so I get that initial data, as I was saying, and whether I'm doing it in a containerized environment, air-gapped environment, my own lab environment, or VM, and start doing some research from there. What do we know about it? Okay, well, some other researchers may have already found out what this thing is and figured it out. Do I need to go through and do this whole extensive research on it or analysis? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe for the situation I have, what other people I've read up on it or VirusTotal has shown about it might be enough to remediate that situation, right? So it's always looking for what is the most biggest bang for my buck without having to waste time, because attacks are never ending. Just because I have one sample doesn't mean another one might not come after it. And reverse engineering is a very time-consuming process, right? But if I have to continue down that path, then from there I start doing basic static analysis, right? Things like looking at the strings content, looking at what API calls are actually in there. Is this sample packed? And if it is packed, how do I unpack it, right? So give you a classic example, the common UPX packer, or the universal packer. That's a very well-known one, and there's very easy ways to tell that it's packed based on the section data. I'll see things like UPX0, UPX1, etc. So that gives me that clue right there that this is packed. And most people will tell me, well, okay, what's the big deal about that? I usually come back and tell them, how much legitimate software do you often see that's packed in some way, shape, or form? And they kind of stop. I'm like, we're not in the 1980s where we have bandwidth restrictions and we need to pack our software in order for it to traverse the network or go to get there. Those days are over. Major software companies, sure, they'll use their own protection methods, proprietary methods, but they're not going to use your off-the-shelf UPX or, and advanced attackers will create their own protection methods, sure. But very, very few times, unless there's a very valid reason, you're not going to see packers in just common software. something that doesn't happen. Yeah, I can see cryptors, I can see protectors, things like that going on. There's a very limited, a very specific reason why you're doing that. You're
Stuff.
trying to stall the analyst from figuring out what's going on.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Keep
No, you're good,
save
sir.
train of thought. Keep going. But the one other thing I want to ask too is, are the majority of these, especially the malware side of it, built upon other malware, or are you seeing unique? You know what I'm saying? Is, I mean, they're like, yeah, I'm going to take a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Is that the reason why they're not yeah, I've had a couple
Obfuscated.
beers. Thank you. And packing these just because of that.
No, well, a lot of times why things get packed, even in your run-of-the-mill code, is just to delay the attacker, delay the analyst. You're trying to waste your time.
Got it.
They know, given it's like passwords, right? Given enough time, any password can be cracked. It's kind of the same with code. Given enough time, someone's going to figure out what is it doing.
Right.
It's can I delay you and frustrate you long enough that either A, you're going to stop, you're going to get frustrated and stop analyzing, or B, delay you long enough so I can get my end goal as an attacker. I can get after my end goal, whether it be data exfil, spreading to another part of the network, whatever the case may be. As far as code reuse goes, it is quite common, even from not just run-of-the-mill attackers. I would say you would have a high majority of code is reused in some way, shape, or form, right? It's just like having DLLs on a system, right? Libraries for any other language. If you write some code that does, I don't know, let's say hashes a file for me, why create my own hashing
Right.
algorithm, my own library? I could just reuse that as a Lego block to be
Right.
plug it in. Even you see advanced attackers a lot of times do this, not just because they're lazy, but it might be a tradecraft method. If Because it looks like it's commodity work or
Right.
someone else's work, I can obfuscate, I can obscure myself as the attacker.
Right.
So there's multiple reasons why they do that, not just out of sheer laziness.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
So there's a good amount of it, absolutely.
Yeah. And so moving on to that, obviously identifying, doing the static and the analysis of that. Do you move on to obviously dynamic on those sheep, which I am going to use that analogy all the time because that's the best thing I've ever heard.
Steak
So I
goats, yeah.
mean, so do you move on to dynamic? Is there a point that you're like, hey, I don't need to do that because obviously I identified
Hmm.
this and the insert
Absolutely.
points or whatever?
Absolutely. And once again, it's all situational based. So if I'm in an incident response type situation, obviously I'm trying to get those indicators of compromise out to my peers that are working with me. So a classic example, James and myself have done several incident responses together. I might find something in that payload that might be a trigger for James to now do threat hunting into the network to look for other things. So I'm generating leads and it's a constant feedback loop where we're feeding each other information and say, hey, based on what I see in the static analysis, I see that it's trying to based on the API calls, it's trying to make a call to this
Mm,
onion domain. That might be a trigger for someone like James or someone else doing threat hunting or doing network forensics, for example. Now I'm going to go look at pile through logs and start doing threat hunting and see, is there any other systems that may have tried to connect to the same domain?
mm-hmm.
And that might generate more information that in turn might help me while my analysis is occurring. So it's a constant feedback loop that you need to, it's not happening in a vacuum for the most part,
Mm,
right?
mm-hmm.
Based on the information I'm gleaning during static analysis, like I said, example, doing strings and I start seeing registry key writes. I see read write on reg query, reg writes, certain API calls are indicators of actions potentially the malware might take. And I say potentially because you don't know. It could be junk code. It could be code there to waste your time. You don't know until you actually see it execute or starts debugging and stepping through it. But based on that information, I start formulating my hypothesis. So based on these registry keys, I believe that this malware will attempt to make a outbound HTTP request to this domain. Right. I see that, based on this domain that's hard coded in here, for example, this looks like it might be the C2 domain. Right. So from there, that might be, hey, let's set up a proxy. Let's get the data and see, does this thing actually communicate to it? What other follow-on information can we get? Maybe there's another stage. Maybe that malware I'm looking at is the loader and not the final payload.
Oh,
So it can start escalating from there as you see. So it might be just continuous, spider webbing outward. But based on that information, if I am able to find a remediation, then I stop there, right? If I cannot, then I'll start going from basic static analysis into dynamic analysis. Dynamic analysis, as the name implies, is I'm actually running the code. It could be in a debugger. It could be me just simply interacting like a normal user. I want to see what happens at the user's perspective. So snapshot my VM, for example. I have all my tools ready to go. So I have my proxy set up, whether it be Burp or something like Fiddler. It's already ready to capture and be the intermediary for me. Might have Wireshark open. Depending on the situation, I might have my box, and the gateway might be to another system, another analysis system.
Mm.
So that traffic gets piped through because maybe I think the malware is looking for certain tools that might be present on the system. Like I had a payload one time that looked for process hacker, and if process hacker is present, it would kill process hacker and kill itself.
Wow.
So you have to kind of look at it almost like it's like a 2D, it's like a chess game you're playing against each other, right?
Right.
I might try based on the information I have, an analysis technique that doesn't work. Then guess what? Revert your snapshot, reset your tooling again, and be like, okay, well, based on what I learned at this stage, I know that the image is looking for these set of tools, or maybe it needed elevated privileges. Now I rerun that payload with elevated privileges and see what happens.
Yeah.
So it's a constant back and forth based on the information I have. Okay, maybe I give the malware a little bit more access or a little bit more permissions and see what happens there and keep
Yeah.
almost trying to force it to reveal itself to me as we're going through it.
So it's a trial and error, right? I mean, it's not
Absolutely.
someone's not going to jump into it and say, "Yeah, okay, I'm going to run this once," or "I'm going to do this." And if it doesn't work, they're like, "Oh, you know what? Sorry." Because you don't know, right? You're looking for
Absolutely.
action. You're trying to figure out exactly what's going on. Now, it's almost like I'm trying to remember what movie that is. It's like rewind, and then you do it again, right? Rewind again and
Yeah,
do it,
yeah.
right? Because you're seeing what the action is. You're like, oh, okay, perfect. I know exactly. All right, let's go back. So, I mean, that's pretty. That's fantastic. I mean, that's really, really cool stuff. And so once you, I mean, how long does this? Obviously, it depends, right? That's the word. But typically, something that you're like, wow, this is either, yeah, I've seen it before. Either by signature or whatever, something's changed or
Mhm.
something is, you're like, yeah, I've seen this before. I mean, how often is it that you're like going, dude, this is some good stuff, as in
Uh,
someone came out with some good stuff
every
versus,
once
you
in
know
a
what, I've seen
while,
this stuff.
every once in a while, I find a new sample that I'm like, wow, this is almost like my nerd curiosity takes into effect, and I'm like, wow, even
I
though
need to
I
meet this person.
no, well, yeah, but and it's weird because you start looking at samples and you start getting an idea of who it is based on how the code was written, whether
Sure.
this was a professional, as an amateur, it was a group of people because the coding styles might be different. They leave maybe their different trademark or how they call variables, how they set up their functions might be different person to person. So you're like, okay, maybe there's a team going on here, right? The example of like the crew that was building Emotet for the longest time. They would go through this software development lifecycle where they would release a new module, new functionality for Emotet and potentially TrickBot. There's some collaboration between the two attack groups. And what they would do is that would work, and when it no longer worked, maybe the industry got onto their attack methods. They reversed the code, figure out the new module does, figure out some defense mechanisms. Then they go to ground for a couple of months at a time, and then they would come back 3 4 months later with a new method. It's like they would go through this whole process of, okay, well, this ended, how do we get a new technique, new system down, and start going through this development life cycle like professional developers do to release out a new product.
They like have a scrum meet. I mean, they're like, hey, let's
It
just
almost feels like, yeah,
right. So
they got
once
their
the
PM standing there telling them project
exactly, they're
timelines
like,
and
dude,
everything.
this is the way we need to do it next time. You know what? If you take that, right, you get to the start of, okay, the remediation side of it. You're like, okay, fantastic. I was bitching. I have this. This is good. We can go and do that, right? What happens after that? I mean, is there any time that you're like, yeah, we need to identify who these people are because of X, Y, and Z, or we have, or is there a repository? I mean, what do you do with that information? Obviously, you're like, hey, we secured this, fantastic. But I mean, what do you do with that information?
A lot of that's all dependent on what your end goal is. If I'm in an incident response type situation, is attribution necessarily needed? Maybe if they broke into some financial information, for example, there's a big part of the
Right.
breach, or maybe there's something like fraud going on where I need to alert like the FBI, things of that nature. That's a different story. But in a common incident response situation, we're looking to triage, remediate the situation, right? Get the company to a state where the bleeding is essentially stopped, they're triaged, and they can start rebuilding or get themselves back operational. So in that case, attribution, it's kind of icing on the cake, but we don't need it to have a good cake. You know what I mean? I need
So
that information to remediate so I can get them going again.
So the reason why I'm bringing that up is because and again, this is my layman's thing on it is that a lot of people reuse code. They wind up they have I mean, you kind of see the same things. I mean, do you think it would be beneficial to actually have I don't want to say signature because it's not necessarily a signature as in hash type of stuff, but some repository that you have some sort of analyst that can go and say, oh yeah, we identified this group. I mean, this group who's creating this, and I know that there are groups that do that, but I mean, it's because I know that people that do this for companies, your regular corporations that might not be government
Yeah,
based,
yeah,
is like, oh, fantastic, we stopped the bleeding. Let's move on to the next one. But I mean, should there be some sort of community between those
absolutely.
people that are doing that they can share the experience, right? I mean,
Yeah,
is there something out there?
there is a few things, and to kind of the IR mindset, right? It's almost like playing an ER doc. You're like, okay, the patient stabilized, time to move on to the next trauma patient and keep going forward from there, right? The one of the problems I've noticed in the blue team side of the house, the red team, the attackers, pen testers, right? It doesn't have to be actual, true criminal adversaries. They're amazing at information sharing. They sit there, they have all these forums and all these techniques. They talk, converse with each other because they don't look at it as almost like you're on my turf unless it directly impacts your operation. Whereas in the blue team side of the house, it's almost like this and not so friendly competition. I'm a consultant, you're a consultant. Why should I tell you, or I'm a vendor, you're a vendor. Why should I tell you how I found that threat? Because now you're cutting into my bottom line instead of looking at it as like, how do we secure the industry as a whole? So part of it's the mindset of it. You can use things obviously like MITRE's attack framework, which is great for tactics, techniques, and procedures and how attackers do it. Obviously there's threat intel corporations out there that they make their living just on threat intel. But obviously, that's a subscription you got to pay for, and they're not sharing with anybody else, as I just said earlier. So there are some things you can do, but a lot of it, unless you're doing your own research, you're not going to really find a lot of it, to be honest with you. And also, to make matters worse, as a defender, when you show up to an incident, how often, even in your mobile forensics investigations, how often do you have every single piece of data you need to make a full conclusion?
Yeah.
There's, logging's missing. You have everything, but at, someone brute force from outside the network, let's say, the logs might have rolled over because they were inadequate in size. Well, I might have everything up until that initial point.
Yeah.
So
I think
you have
that
a lot of missing pieces you have to kind of piece together and figure
yeah, and
out what's going on.
I think that's a pretty good analogy if you look at the mobile forensic side of it because it's a pretty competitive environment. I don't want to say unfortunately, obviously. I mean, well, yes, kind of. It's changing though, and I think, and I don't want to say COVID changed this or us being locked up, but I think there's been a larger community of people that are like, yeah, you know what, this is just BS. That
Absolutely.
we need to continue to go in and need to share. Like Alexis. I mean, there's open source tools. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of. It seems like there's a lot more community, and so I mean, it only helps, right? Because it, I was going to cliche phrase. I'm not going to do it, but it's. Oh, I keep wanting to say it, but I'm not going to. Is that the thing is you might see something that's exactly what someone else is going to see, right? We all are working for the same reason, right? Make the world a better place type of thing is that we want to go in and protect our environment because a lot of the actors, and that's just me, are from out of state and out of state.
Out of country. Yeah.
So that's a thing, right? And so does it come down to money?
No, I don't think it always comes down to money. I think a lot of it comes down to personal ego and pride. They want to say, "I found this and you didn't," right? It's almost like a measuring contest, if you will.
Yeah,
All right, it's kind of that bragging rights. Well, I reversed that code, you didn't. Look
yeah,
at you, right?
yeah,
Part of it also, and I agree with you, it has gotten better in recent years, primarily this last year and a half, is that where's the reporting mechanism? Where do we have to centrally drop off information? Sure, if a case warrants it, you might go to you might have to reach out to the FBI or the Secret Service if it's dealing with like money, for instance, money laundering or type things like that. But the problem is a lot of these federal agencies, they never talk to you again. You
right.
give them the information, you say thank you, bye, and then you never hear anything about it. And you're like, okay, well, how does that help me?
Yeah.
Okay,
I
you
mean,
ran
I
off
mean
of my
that's
information. I got nothing. In a non-government service type situation, where can I drop off the information? There is no real collaborative initiative, and a company's not going to pay for it out of their own pocket. Individuals may not have time or effort or ability to manage that themselves.
yeah.
So it becomes this kind of disparate, hunt for information.
Yeah, so thinking of time, right? I mean, if someone has already seen, I mean, kind of the, and I want to say signature, but that's not the right word. The same path, the same functions, the same things
Absolutely.
that they've seen that. Do you think? I mean, what's the time saving side if you're able to go in and say, function, I'm going to take your shit type of thing and search it up in this little
Absolutely.
community. Here's the function name. That you're able to like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't exist. And so,
Absolutely.
again, I think you're exactly right. It comes down to those people that have said, yeah, I did it. Why am I going to share that with anybody else because it's
Job
mine?
security.
Yeah, exactly. And unfortunately, I think that's, again, why does it always come down to the human element, right? Human element of breaches and then human element of not helping out. So, how can we help? I mean, how can we go in and I mean, is this something that needs to start? Maybe some sort of
Absolutely.
community that's able to go in and have some more communication. Y-
Absolutely. And I think the biggest part is, we're not going to get buy-in. Even if we started something tomorrow morning and you had all this backing with it, until people check their ego at the door, it's not going to happen, right? Until they realize, like I used to tell my soldiers when I was in the military, still active duty, don't worry about being recognized. Just seek to be worthy of the recognition, right? Let your actions speak for themselves.
Yeah,
So I have no problems personally sharing every bit of information I have,
yeah.
because that might save me from having to deal with some catastrophe later on.
True story.
And I know for a fact that I've not necessarily taken, but I've researched other people. I've researched functions or names or even malware itself, and other people have had amazing write-ups where I'm like, wow, okay, you saved me. I understand everything you did here.
Right.
You saved me hours, maybe
Yeah,
days in some cases worth of work.
yeah.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to go use that to benefit the organization and the fight that we're doing on this side here. So part of that is giving that community back, hey, giving that praise to people and saying, hey, thank you for your work. I appreciate it, instead of just taking it and walking away, but also resharing, putting out blogs, forums, even something on Twitter, and be like, hey, look at this amazing write up this person did.
Yeah.
And kind of being the evangelist of it and promoting that this is a communal effort and it's not us against each other. And at the same time, fighting all the adversaries on the other side.
Yeah, I think you're right because the thing is there's enough work for everyone. I can promise you that and it is not it's not going to go away. It will not go away. I mean, it'll only get, it might move, right? Everyone's going to be utilizing, some sort of AWS or Azure or some system itself, but that still is a physical actually it's living here. I
Absolutely.
mean, it's always the same. So I don't think it's going to go. And as more things come online, everything's online right now, and there's so many different types of endpoints and vectors and all these different layers that it's only going to I
It's only
mean
going to increase.
it will. It'll completely increase. But the problem is I think that we're behind, in kind of the sharing and trying to get some things going on. But hey, we can talk forever on the humanity
Yeah,
of
absolutely.
DFIR type of stuff. But it is so. What I want you to go. So I don't want to take it too much. We have just a little. I want you to within 3 minutes give me the coolest little, if you want to talk remediation, or the coolest little malware you found that did some crazy stuff, and say, give people, man, where you might have to look for some of this. What's your number one honeypot? Well, that's a bad thing to say too, but your one place that you want to go that you're like, hey, every investigation, this is where you need to look.
Absolutely. So, um, my coolest story, I'll start there first, right? And actually, me and James did this incident together. I was a young intern at the time, right, working for an organization. Once again, not going to say their name, not going to say what led to the catalyst that led to the situation, but they were breached, and everyone basically woke up to Sam ransomware everywhere. Just like imagine walking to work and everything, like the whole building's on fire, proverbially, right? That's exactly what happened. So I was part of the incident response team just because it was all hands on deck every adventure. And at the time, my boss, he was a great guy, I still talk to him. He had a lot of faith in me, but some of the other people I was working with, they're like, "Oh, you're an intern. Sit down in your corner, go get us coffee, do whatever," right? And it was very evident these people hadn't had true cybersecurity experience. They were cyber in name, but not in practitioners, right? So I'm sitting there just doing my thing as a malware analyst, and I'm, got a copy of the code, at least the initial payload that somebody had found. And then I come up to my boss. And I'm like, "Hey, man, I know nobody wants to hear it, but here's all my analysis. Here's everything we should be looking for." And just kind of started spawning out from there. So as an intern, I started directly affecting everything. And then my boss, my immediate boss, SOC manager, is like, "Hey, everyone, stop what you're doing. Listen to this. Pay attention to this." This is who we started, and it became one of the driving forces. And then James came in later on as a different capacity with the National Guard, with the military. I basically at that time got told, "Hey, man, you're an intern. You can't work more than 40 hours. Go home." The National Guard calls me up. He's like, "Hey, man, you want to come over with our cyber team?" So I show back up next day basically in uniform, if you will, as a member of the military. Like, "Hey, well, we're here to deal with this situation because it is a critical infrastructure being affected and a possible life safety nexus." And basically, we just went to work and started going from there.
Right.
So as an intern, I eventually basically led to full remediation of a major catastrophic event and almost fully reverse engineering SamSam ransomware.
Fantastic.
So it was
Fantastic.
just curiosity, research.
Right.
Biggest places that I look at as attackers do. Attackers are always going to try to stay relevant. They're going to try to stay on your network, on your system in some way, shape, or form. Think of it like a virus in real world, right? It's trying to propagate and spread and stay alive in some way. Your body, just like your system, is that host that it's feeding resources off of, right? So registry keys, your run once keys. So take a look at that HKLM, HKCU hives. They're hanging out in their startup folders, right? So what I used to show my junior analyst, I'd be like, "Here's MITRE. Here's the MITRE attack framework. Go look at all the auto run methods.
Right.
Every single one of these are common places you need to look at. Keep a checklist and go through these." So even when I'm doing a basic triage, I dump out the registry and take a look. Okay, is there anything in the run once key, for example? Is there anything in the startup folder? Is there anything services that are being set to run?
Yeah.
What is going on with these, the common places? So are these services, where are they actually pointing to? And I say that because they might point to a different location on the system that now I can go look at and see what is it calling somewhere else, right? The final thing that I would say commonly, I tell my young analysts, SOC analysts, or somebody interested in malware is common prevalent, living off the land. A lot of payloads like to stay in memory these days. So how do we handle that situation?
Right.
Right? It may not write the executable, the original executable might write on disk. Maybe it does, and maybe it does not. TrickBot, for example, Windows 10, it would keep everything in memory. If you had it on a Windows 7 system, the same payload, it'd write the artifacts to disk because some of these configuration settings weren't present in 7 and Windows 10, right? So it's going to stay in memory. So, okay, maybe I need more than just I'm a SOC analyst. Maybe I need to pick up a little bit of memory forensic skills.
Right.
And all these other skills you pick up tie in together to make this kind of functional, complete investigator, if you will.
Right. Now, fantastic. No, that's some great stuff. And it's funny because I always say Windows. Windows is kind of like me now. I have to write everything down to remember it because that's what Windows does, right?
I'm the
Everything.
angry penguin. I'm a Linux guy. Right?
Exactly.
My daily driver
That's
is a
good.
Linux system.
I was just gonna say that's good, right? Because Windows loves it. It's just the natural scratch pad. So awesome. My beer is done. I kept you a little bit long, but again, it could have been longer for sure. So definitely going to have to
Absolutely.
have you back. I appreciate all of the fantastic information that you've shared for everyone.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me. Look forward to next time. And yeah, next time let's do a deep dive in malware or something.
Oh, I think so. I
Let's go
think
further
so.
in. Yeah.
I'm gonna talk some old school stuff that I actually got into quite a bit of that Android stuff. So yeah.
My first, I'll leave this thought out there. My first piece of malware was the Melissa virus. That was the first one that
Oh,
back in the yeah.
excellent.
So that's my
Excellent.
introduction to like real world malware.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, we'll look at it. Yeah, we will definitely talk about it. Awesome. I will see you again soon. Yes?
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Excellent. Another fantastic. I mean, honestly, can really kind of get into it, especially with and talking about malware. And I think, well, one of the important takeaways is to again, it all comes down to kind of community. Things change so quickly now, especially in the environments that we're in, that I think communication, speaking to that, can kind of, I don't want to say shorten maybe the investigative side of it, but working together, taking things slow, trying to look and I maybe think like the bad guy, because again, as we're at home, as we're all doing all of these different types of things, just think about what you're doing, at home when you're on the computer. You might be in the forensic side of it, so you're like, hey, thinking about, yeah, I don't, yeah, I, who would ever do that? People would. So, think about some of those things, be able to go in and formulate and analyze some of those items. So, again, another great one. I appreciate everybody watching. I believe next week might have another, yeah, for sure, another cybersecurity stuff, because I kind of dig it. And it's getting out of kind of my mobile phone side of it, but just learning a ton along with you guys. So I appreciate everyone's time. Everyone have a great weekend.